The idea that a former Home Secretary is saying this, that Britain has become taken over, and assumes, when you use the phrase millions of people, that everyone who is Muslim is anti-British, is anti-integration, and that just is not true.
I think there is an element to her politics, and we're seeing it more and more on different figures on the right, but and on the online right in particular, they egg each other on. So, for example, there was one the other day on the Telegraph and in the Sun saying, you might have seen it the other day, saying 1 in 12 in London now an illegal migrant.
Yeah, I saw that.
Came out as total bull.
Of course, integration is essential, but work towards solutions rather than building problems and stoking division, which this speech does.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
What happens if the UK falls into the hands of Muslim fundamentalism? Our legal system gets substituted by Sharia law, and our nuclear capabilities vest in a regime not dissimilar to that of Iran today. Regardless of whether one thinks this is a realistic outcome, which I do not, should we not have the courage to ask these questions and look at where our country is heading?
That was our former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, speaking at the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank in Washington, D.C. this week. In it, as you heard there, she posits the idea, originally from the now Vice President, J.D. Vance, that in a couple of decades, the UK could be an Islamist state with nuclear weapons, an arch enemy of the United States. She says that she doesn't believe it herself, but it's worth talking about. On the show today, we ask, is it really worth talking about? And why is Suella Braverman going around the world at least positing ideas, thoughts in their head that would once have been considered completely extreme? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And there is a long history of former senior politicians beating a path to the American Policy Institutes on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., which are very well funded, which invite Brits to come over and speak about Churchill or whatever it happens to be. There seems to be a cultural shift taking place where British politicians of the right, and I mean, you know, Liz Truss has done this as well, have gone over there to make speeches seemingly to denigrate Britain, not talk up Britain, but to denigrate what Britain is and what it might become.
The great patriots, of course.
The great patriots. They're talking down Britain and presenting a kind of two-dimensional view of this country that seems to profoundly lack nuance or comprehension of what is going on.
I think this is really interesting, what Suella Braverman has been doing and her journey, because it's interesting in and of itself, because this was and is, you know, we're not talking about some fringe figure here. We're talking about someone who's still a Conservative MP, someone who was Home Secretary, someone who was recently wanted to be the leader of her party. And again, we should say that on that particularly explosive thing around the idea of Britain becoming an Islamist state, Suella Braverman posits the idea and then says she doesn't believe it herself, but it's worth talking about. But then, as I was saying before, the question is, why talk about it? And the speech was full of other ideas that probably don't necessarily become someone who, until quite recently, was responsible for counter-extremism in the UK. But it's also interesting because of she's not alone. There are lots of others, or certainly several others, previously mainstream, both Conservative MPs and voices, who are undergoing what I think is a very radical journey. And the fact it is not more remarked upon, how extraordinary it is, the things that they are saying, tells us something about how far our values and mores are shifting and have shifted, even quite recently. In that speech at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, she raised the spectre, the prospect, of the UK being an Islamist country within 20 years, an Islamist nuclear-armed state. And she cited, among others, and this is how commonplace these ideas have become in this UK-US very radical kind of online world, she cited the now Vice President, J.D. Vance, who you might remember said something quite similar during the American presidential election campaign.
Vice President J.D. Vance said at the National Conservative Conference, at which I also spoke in the summer here in DC, that the UK was going to be the first Islamist nation with nuclear weapons. I don't think he was entirely joking. Is it an impossibility that 20 years from now, it will be the UK, not China or Russia, that will emerge as the greatest strategic threat to the USA, born out of a broken relationship and weak leadership?
And that is what? That Britain is going to become the greatest strategic threat to the United States of America within 20 years.
It is absolutely mental.
It is just bizarre for that to be said seriously. So you can imagine that on One American News Network and Christian Radio and Fox News Network, they are going to be saying, oh my God, well, former British Home Secretary has come out here and told us that within 20 years, Britain could be in the hands of Islamists and the greatest strategic threat to the United States.
Do you know, John, what the Muslim population of Britain is right now in percentage terms?
Well, I'm going to guess it's between 5 and 10.
6%.
Yeah.
So Suella Braverman is suggesting that the Muslim population, not just the Muslim population, but within that, the Islamist-oriented bit of the Muslim population will be sufficiently large by the year 2045 to have managed to exert political control in Britain, presumably to have won a general election in Britain, and not only to have done that, but have convinced enough of the population that America is actually a massive threat to us and potentially train our nuclear weapons on them. I mean, this is conspiracy-laden stuff that would make some of the most frenzied corners of the internet blush. I mean, it leans into conspiracy around Muslims. It leans into the Great Replacement theory, an absolute staple of the far right over many years, the idea that Muslims, or whoever it happens to be, are just coming to replace us one by one. And it leans into absolutely batshit stuff about the idea that there is going to be a mainstream Islamist party takeover in Britain, which again has been a staple and currency of the far right. And I would not, as I say, be surprised to hear Tommy Robinson say this, or it's not even Reform Party MPs or anything. I think they wouldn't touch this. This is Suella Braverman saying this.
Well, you mentioned the Great Replacement theory, which has, of course, been the staple of a lot of the American far right. And I remember in Charlottesville, Virginia, when Trump's first term, and there were white supremacists marching, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Can you imagine a senior British politician going to America and saying, there is a Zionist conspiracy out there. There is a Zionist conspiracy where the Jews are going to take over and they are going to be a threat to this one and that one, and that you can't trust them at all. She used a phrase in her speech that there are millions who are coming to this country without our best interests at heart. Now, I happen to agree with Suella Braverman on a certain part of this. There is a real problem with integration of people not learning the language, not accepting the culture, not integrating into British society. Absolutely spot on. But to say, when you have been the Home Secretary, when you have been responsible for this, that there are millions coming into the country without our interests, British interests at heart, who's counted? What metric? Where is the numbers? Where are the stats that we can scrutinise that? Because there aren't any. And that way, you just sow mistrust of people who are coming to this country. Yes, there are problems, but to exaggerate it into millions is just painting with the broadest brush and showing no attention to detail.
And this is the point. Two things can be true at once. Yes, perhaps historically, some politicians have been too squeamish to talk about integration. It's important. I happen to think, actually, by comparison to a lot of other countries, including our closest neighbours, including the United States, where she was, actually, the British model has actually been very successful in the round. Of course, there are problems, but has largely been successful on integration. But of course, there are problems. And it can be absolutely true that we have had pockets and problems which continue to exist. There have been, particularly when there's been a very high rate of people coming from certain countries, in pockets of cities. That can be a problem with crime and so on. We've seen it in other European countries like Malmo in Sweden, importation of a gang culture. Big problem. And we should be absolutely explicit about that. The media, mainstream media, we need to call that out. We need to talk about it in terms that people appreciate and understand. So do politicians and so on. That can all be true. But that is very, very different from basically tarring an entire community, which is very often what happens with these descriptions. Millions of people, suggesting that there are millions of people in the country that do not have the best interests of the rest of us at heart. And she used a very particular term in her speech as well, one of the most inflammatory terms which exists in matters such as this. She suggested there was a fifth column at work in Britain. Listen to this.
The truth is that Britain has imported a fifth column into our society, a column that refuses to integrate, refuses to abide by our laws, our customs and our values.
And just so if you don't know the term the fifth column actually comes from the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
You know, it's talking about an enemy within, a group of people who are actively agitating against us all the time. And again, there can be minorities, and clearly, you know, we've had terrorists in this country. You know, we've had terrorists, Islamic terrorists. We've also had far-right terrorists. I don't think Suella Braverman's got them in mind. With far-right terrorists, no doubt she would say, well, that's a small group of people and that's outrageous. But she wouldn't make grand, sweeping, extrapolating statements on the basis of that minority, which is what this debate often comes down to, whether with regards to Muslims. And frankly, a lot of it, in my view, is deeply, deeply anti-Muslim.
The question you have to ask is this a politician working with all her might to solve a problem or to exaggerate a problem? Because the struggle I have with language like that and enemies within, just speak to it, it kind of gives it an air of menace and danger. Look, we've got problems in this society. You know, societies around the world have got all sorts of problems. They've got brain drains, they've got integration issues. Yeah, they are there. But by exaggerating the problem, you make it worse. You do not make it better. And I just think, I remember when I was in America and I was doing Vox Pops in South Carolina at some college football event, and hearing this American woman say to me, well, the problem with Britain is there's full of no-go areas because the Islamists have taken over. And I remember feeling utter shock and sort of laughing when she said this to me. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm from Britain. I'm from London. There aren't no-go areas. There are areas where you kind of maybe watch yourself a bit more closely, but there aren't no-go areas. The idea that a former Home Secretary is saying this, that Britain has become taken over like this, I just don't think it accords with a reality, and assumes, when you use the phrase millions of people, that everyone who is Muslim is anti-British, is anti-integration, and that just is not true.
So if I were a young British Muslim today, completely subscribed, I've got my own faith, my own religion, but completely subscribed to broadly the sort of values of the sort of society that we live in, I would be so worried and scared by some of the rhetoric that we hear from very mainstream people, because it sort of suggests that there is a basic incompatibility between who I am and my faith and the society in which I live. And I think that is problematic. And I think that, look, you know, Suella Braverman, who, you know, we asked to come on, by the way, she didn't want to, but she said she would be listening. Suella Braverman is one person. But I think the very fact that, you know, you can have a figure like this, make a speech like this, and it gets picked up and it gets covered, but half the time, actually, by most of the press, it gets covered glowingly and admiringly. It shows, I think, that there are almost no limits on the right at the moment to how far you can push some of this stuff. And John, I think your example is very apposite and right. I mean, imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had said something along the lines of, you know, well, the problem is with our society is that there are too many Jews in control, and that means you can't say various things, or they're, you know, going to replace us, or whatever it happened to be. The uproar that would engender, entirely correctly, entirely rightly. And by the way, I don't think he would say that, because I don't think he would believe those things. But, you know, if he had done. And I think that it shows how very quickly, you know, we talk about the Overton window, you know, the idea of what's acceptable within a society to think and to say. I think this stuff has moved very, very quickly. The fact, the very fact that, as far as I know, this hasn't got much coverage almost anywhere. We're talking about it.
It complicates our relations with America, where there's an audience, a ready audience for this. It complicates kind of race relations at home, where people are going to feel more alienated and more polarised. It doesn't feel to me, and I say this as someone who grew up in the East End of London, where my parents were community workers, trying to work on integration issues after the Second World War, with the big influx of a Jewish population who'd fled Nazi Germany and all the rest of it and fled Europe. And of course integration is essential, but work towards solutions rather than building problems and stoking division, which this speech does.
And it happens again and again. We're seeing in the press at the moment this narrative which is building up. I mean, this is the thing. Part of it with Suella. I mean, when we were in Washington, by the way, we saw Suella Braverman. She was sort of hanging out at the hotel that we were at with, say, Lawrence Fox, having breakfast together. And even that, I remember thinking, God, Lawrence Fox, who is, a very, very controversial figure, let's put it at that. He was tweeting even while we were there about how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a bitch and how Dr. Anthony Fauci is basically the modern 21st century Joseph Mengele. And, I mean, this absolutely beyond the pale stuff. And, whether they went there together or not, but she was pictured coming off the airport with Fox and sort of smiling, and then she was there, and you're just thinking, God, this is our Home Secretary, and she's sort of, this is the company that she keeps. But this is the point. I think there is an element to her politics, and we're seeing it more and more on different figures on the right, but and on the online right in particular, they egg each other on. There is this sort of online right world, which is now UK, US, where actually, I mean, they accuse people like us, or they accuse, the libs or liberal media, whatever, of being in our own world. Actually, in my experience, so conscious are often the people in the kind of liberal media these days of that charge, right? That there's been an actually attempt very often to overcompensate, to overcorrect, precisely to try and see that off. These people never challenge their own views. Not in a million years. They exist in an online bubble, which has actually developed very recently, where they're exchanging all of these stories. So, for example, there was one the other day on the Telegraph and in the Sun saying, you might have seen it the other day, saying 1 in 12 in London now an illegal migrant.
Yeah, I saw that.
Came out as total bull. That it turned out, in fact, the Sun had to actually put out a correction yesterday where they said the figures, in fact, only covered 7 million people, not the full 9 million population, and further, the 1 in 12 included some legal migrants, including those with indefinite leave to remain.
What is happening to Suella Braverman? Was that always there in her?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I don't know. I think that what there is, and there has been a radicalisation on the online right. We talk about online radicalisation. I think there have been lots of political figures in Britain who have undergone that transformation before our very eyes. And I would put Braverman in that category. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation about her future and about whether she might leave the Conservative Party and join Reform. You kind of get the impression that maybe they don't want her. I actually asked that question of Nigel Farage on Sunday on LBC. This is what he said.
Do you know what? I only want people in Reform who come with a shared mission. They've got to commit themselves to it. And what I absolutely wouldn't want is anybody coming from any other parties who brought with them endless internecine internal warfare.
Didn't sound like he was piping her aboard saying, welcome,
come on
Suella.
In, Suella. Yeah, no. Well, I think because there will be an awareness that she might make speeches like this. And the weird thing is that, I mean, Farage and Reform are not exactly moderate on these issues. They know that they've already got quite a lot of people who are concerned about these things. They've got them in the bank. They know they need to expand their appeal. They know that there are Conservative inclined voters, maybe Labour inclined voters as well, who are maybe like the sort of things that Farage says, but a bit worried about the idea, some of his previous views, or what they think are his previous views. So maybe the last thing they need is having an MP like Suella Braverman going to Washington and suggesting that there is a fifth column within Britain. To be fair, language that Farage has used in the distant past himself, but I don't think would use now.
Yeah, anyway, Suella, you are still welcome on the Newsagents podcast.
Always.
In a moment, we'll be back with the reality of Britain today. Rachel Reeves' speech for growth. What does business think of it? We'll be speaking to the head of Octopus Energy. So yesterday we had the big speech from Rachel Reeves, the spurt for growth, or whatever you want to call it, where she unveiled various different things, the third runway and a whole series of other projects that she hopes will kickstart the British economy. And I guess the kind of question today is, do business buy it? And we are joined in the studio by Greg Jackson, who was the founder of a little startup called Octopus Energy, which has become rather big in the interim. And I guess your story is of showing how you can start from something very small and grow very fast. Do you think that Rachel Reeves has got it?
Look, I think prior to the election, people were genuinely impressed, right, by the degree of business engagement by Rachel and indeed Keir Starmer. I think after the election, not only did things get a bit quieter, but also, we had the, let's call it the sort of mixed reaction to the budget. But I think the big picture, and I saw Rachel at Davos last week talking to business people and being questioned by them. And we see it through both yesterday's speech and some of today's interviews and response. We do have a Chancellor who's genuinely focused on growth. And you've got to remember, quite often the Treasury is it's the friction in the economy. And I think using the power of the Treasury and the power of that position to be front and centre on trying to drive growth is good. Where we are in terms of, the question was, do business people kind of get to believe it, The reactions I heard last week and this week suggested a sort of cautious optimism that, there was engagement with questions from business. It's not just the set pieces, it's answering the questions that come from the floor. But also, big stuff like the third runway, if they can really follow up the announcements with action, these are things that suggest the UK is, kind of fit for investment, fit for growth.
You seem to doubt that they're going to achieve this.
In business and indeed politics and everything else, I think execution is reality, and the intent is good. I think the tone is improving. I think now...
Was the budget a disaster?
I didn't think so. I just thought the communications weren't ideal. But, our business, we employ 11,000 people, 8,500 in the UK. So I think, we've got a good read on it. I think that the distraction from the big pictures that could drive growth, driven by, the coverage afterwards was not what we want. We want to be talking about the great opportunities in Britain, to be taking the British opportunity to investors around the world. And there's a couple of things there that are hidden away underneath this that are not as obvious. I think the Chancellor talks about pension reforms, in reforming the way that pension funds can be invested. That could be the single biggest driver of growth. So we've got a lot of the stuff that is very tangible in the headlines about planning and certain projects, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. But at the moment, only 3% of British pension fund money is invested in British companies, right? And that's because of a whole pile of regulation. If we can do a couple of things, one is create bigger funds by amalgamating a lot of the small ones, so they can make better decisions on behalf of the people who are going to be drawing pensions. And the second thing is deal with some of the regulation that means that they can invest in British companies. I think that will inject dramatically more investment into growth than many people realise.
But Greg, if you were a betting man, I don't know if you are, if you were a betting man, do you think that if we were sat here in 2035, 2040, did you think that runway will actually have been built?
I mean, look, I've been around so long that I saw that, we've had so many announcements over the years. I think what it needs is really rapid action if you're going to see it. But we live in a country where simultaneously, I think we can all be slightly embarrassed that we can't build a railway line, HS2. But at the same time, Crossrail's been a tremendous success. Throughout the Crossrail project, you never kind of knew how well it was going. But now you've got a revolutionary, significant transport infrastructure upgrade that has happened. So I think we can see in Britain, we can get stuff right and we get it wrong. I just hope that we get some of these things right.
Do you agree with the Chancellor, as someone who knows energy well, do you agree with the Chancellor that there is no trade-off between growth and our climate change commitments?
Yeah, look, and first of all, our company is kind of evidence you can do both, right? Uh-huh. So we've grown from 0 to 11,000 employees in 9 years with a business that is all about clean energy. And it's not just the energy supply that, people are probably familiar with. But we've got around $10 billion worth of renewable generation. And we export software to maybe 20 countries around the world. In fact, we also build generation in around 20 countries. And so I think the key here is we need to be able to adopt clean energy technologies whilst driving costs down for consumers.
But can you do that? Because you need to have the massive, in order to get, if they're serious, for example, I mean, the government is still, as far as I know, nominally committed to clean energy by 2030, or clean electricity grid by 2030 to be precise. In order to do that, you need massive investment. You need massive investment in infrastructure. That's got to be paid for. Ultimately, it'll come from consumers, won't it?
I mean, almost everything we see around us was investment at some time.
Yeah, sure.
And a lot of it has brought down bills. You know, companies invest
Over the long term, but in the short to
Yeah.
medium term, isn't it true to say, it is actually a bit of a logical fallacy to say that clean energy is always cheaper energy? It's not always.
It's not always, and that's why, you know, look, you'll see us talking all the time about the importance of market reform. You know, the reality is that, for example, onshore wind power is the cheapest electricity we've ever had. Solar is unbelievably cheap, and they're both capable of getting cheaper every year. The problem is we've got this outdated energy system. So today, when it's windy, we pay the wind farms in Scotland to turn off, right? And we pay them to turn off because we don't have the grid to send them to England, we don't have the batteries to store it, or indeed we don't have the market. That means we sell it cheaply in Scotland. So, you know, for example, we are passionate about something called locational pricing, balancing supply and demand at in every region. If we did that, the UK would go from having some of the most expensive electricity certainly in Europe, if not the world, to the cheapest. Scotland would have the cheapest electricity in Europe if we did this. And countries that have got it, like Scandinavia, Norway, you know, they've got electricity, industrial electricity, it's 3 times cheaper than ours. Household electricity is cheaper. And they're the ones that are attracting the energy-intensive industries, both traditional ones like steel and new ones like data centres.
What about carbon capture and storage? Because Rachel Reeves has made a big saying about the investment that's going to be made there. Is that money well spent?
My own view is that carbon capture and storage is basically saying you can burn gas or even coal to generate electricity and then capture the carbon that comes out the chimneys and store it. Now, if the fossil fuel companies want to do that, that's great, they should pay for it. I don't think it should go on people's bills.
So the answer is no to my original question.
I would say let's spend our investment on a cheaper, cleaner future system, not on extending the life of something that's already expensive. Look, right now...
So why do you think
it's
the
easy
government's
to
doing
forget.
it? You've made the argument. Why do you think the government is doing it then?
Well, first of all, it's easy to forget. I think the UK incurred £75 billion of cost during the gas crisis. Fossil fuels throughout my life, every now and then, have crises that cost us astonishing amounts of money, cause fuel poverty, cause industrial costs to go through the roof, cause inflation and high interest rates. Investing in clean energy, wind and solar, helps remove us from those risks. Investing in expensive ways to extend the life of gas just keeps us exposed to them. So I think the reason that governments do these things is huge lobbying from those incumbent companies, right? Because the reality is, companies that are just building and setting out now don't have lobbying arms. Companies that have been around 100 years, especially in energy, are more deeply entwined with government than anyone else.
What about what's going on in the US? I mean, can you understand someone listening to this who thinks, well, look, it's all very well talking about clean energy, but in a sense, what's the point? Because we're in a situation where, we've now got a Trump administration which has pulled out of Paris. It is doing drill baby drill. It's actually leaning back towards fossil fuels because they say it's cheaper. We've got China, which is still obviously, opening lots and lots of new fossil fuel plants, including coal-fired plants. I mean, what's the point?
Okay,
I
so
mean,
there's a
little
lot
old
there,
Britain.
Lewis, right? So first of all, let's pick up on your last point, China. The rate of build of China's fossil fuels has ground almost to a halt. Instead,
It's still massive, though.
59% of all the renewables built in the world last year were built in China, right? Chinese research and development. We saw this week with DeepSeek the astonishing extent to which Chinese investment in science is enabling them, frankly, to show that the West are laggards on so many areas. And clean energy is one of them. More than half the cars sold in China last year were electric, and it's accelerating. Shanghai, Beijing, these are cities where a few years ago you wore a face mask, not because of COVID, but because of pollution.
And meanwhile, Europe is deindustrialising.
Right. Well, and China's building all this renewable power because it's the cheapest power, and they know that as a prime input to all industries, it's the key to their future. They're not doing it just because they're nice people. They may or may not be. They're doing it because it makes economic sense for them. Now, we talk about the US. when Trump last came to power, he said coal was the future. During that administration, the US usage of coal fell by 40%. Texas, a state that is hardly known as being sort of, happy clappy, woke, is the home to more renewables than any other state in the US.
And yet, even during the Biden administration, the US extracted more hydrocarbons than at any point in its history.
Yeah, and I'm not here to apologise for nor criticise,
no, of course,
administrations of the past. But I would say there are two lessons from all of this. The first one from the Biden administration, a lot of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act went into supporting incumbent industries, the fossil fuel industries. Huge amounts of subsidy into things like carbon capture, which I've just said I don't think is good, because what really matters is bringing bills down for people as you build clean energy. We've just done some polling where in the UK 43% of people support net zero, 20% oppose. So more than twice as many people support it. If energy bills keep going up, 70% of those that support it will stop supporting it. Amazingly, if energy bills go down, then around a third of the people who oppose it will start supporting it. It's not about net zero. Net zero is not yet that touchstone issue. The touchstone issue is energy bills. And that's why we need things like these kind of market reforms to bring electricity prices down. And we need it urgently.
It's the 5th anniversary of Brexit today. Happy Brexit Day, by the way. As a businessman, how do you think it's gone?
Look, I think it's quite clear that people don't want to reopen the debate. What I can say is, for example, we've got a factory in Northern Ireland where we manufacture heat pumps, and we're still at a stage where supply chains can be difficult. Ordering small quantities of parts to build, to experiment with new models from European suppliers is slow and cumbersome, and we still need ways to reduce the friction. And I think, look, when you're doing really big volumes of stuff, maybe it works. I don't know about other industries. But it really affects things like experimentation, where you're finding a new supplier and they've got to fill out a load of paperwork and spend a fortune for a small initial order. That's painful.
So would you like to see the government move closer to the EU?
I think Britain's got a huge opportunity in trade to be a bridge. We spoke earlier about China. The gap between Chinese technologies and ours, we've always thought of the West as being more advanced, but the reality is, as with DeepSeek, and honestly the same applies in things like batteries and electric vehicles, China is moving ahead of us, not because of low wages, but because of huge investment in R&D. We've got to find ways to work with all the parts of the world. So, for example, the UK could be a great bridge in saying, how do the West and China find a way to work together? Because otherwise that gap just gets worse. How do we find a way to work with America when trade is often being touted as a sort of a weapon, and of course with Europe, and still today, the UK is culturally, obviously geographically, and commercially extremely close.
Just one final thing. You talked about how you were with Rachel Reeves last week in Davos, and she was answering the questions from British business leaders. What did the colleagues in the room think of how she did? Were they convinced? Did she answer a few questions yesterday?
Yeah. So yesterday, I caught up with a FTSE 100 CEO, and not someone who's either prone to supporting or not supporting, but is just kind of making an observation, almost like an appraisal. And I think the impression was Rachel had come back after Christmas, sort of stronger and clearly listening and engaged. I think I got the same impression when I spoke to people at Davos, and it was particularly, though, on the answering the questions from the floor, which are often more challenging and unprepared, where you really got a sense of kind of the degree to which, first of all, the government, have been thinking about things and are willing to tackle. So, for example, recent announcements on non-doms. That I've got no view. I'm very happily a British citizen, pay my taxes here, but I do know that non-doms kind of topic was a real sort of lightning rod for a lot of international investors who just wanted to feel welcome in Britain. And recent discussion on that appears to be suggesting, they're beginning to feel more welcome again. And that's just one example.
Greg Jackson, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you both. Thank you.
We should say that Greg arrived here via line bike without any entourage, which is not your kind of average.
You wouldn't get John Sopel doing that.
No, I have to have a fleet of cars to bring me.
He has a motorcade.
Well, explains the hair.
Sopelcade.
Yeah, exactly. Before we go, as you know, if you're going to become part of an American cabinet, you need to have a confirmation hearing on Capitol Hill in front of senators. And Robert F. Kennedy is currently undergoing that. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a conspiracy theorist, and has said a whole heap of 100% pure 24-carat bullshit. And yesterday, he was questioned on some of the more far-fetched ideas he's promulgated.
Did you say that Lyme disease is highly likely a materially engineered bioweapon? I made sure I put in the highly likely. Did you say Lyme disease is a highly likely militarily engineered bioweapon?
I probably did say that.
Did you say that?
And that's what the developer of
I
Lyme
want all
disease
of our
said.
colleagues to hear it, Mr. Kennedy. I want them to hear it. You said yes. Did you say that exposure to pesticides causes children to become transgender?
No, I never said that.
Okay, I have the record that I'll give to the chairman, and he can make his judgment about what you...
Ticks will be astonished.
Yeah.
This refers to a long-established conspiracy theory on the American right, which has suggested that Lyme disease was the result of an accidental release from a secret bioweapons experiment, which because it sort of posits that basically Lyme disease was released from a military lab in the late 1980s, as many scientists have said. And pointed out that in fact there is evidence that Lyme disease was around, or was first identified conclusively in 1945. In fact, as long ago in Cape Cod as 1896.
Hang on, that was a biolab in Cape Cod.
What, in 1896?
Yeah, secret biolab.
Chester
in Cape
Arthur
Cod.
had all of those. President Arthur had those
Exactly.
biolabs. The
Yeah.
back.
Yeah, no good. You can't trust the word.
Anyway, this guy's going to be the health secretary, probably. So that's good. And again, just goes back to our previous discussion. The lunatics are in charge of the asylum.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.